The room was quiet when my father said it. Not angry, not apologetic, just certain. The money was gone. $187,000 that had existed my entire life, spoken about at dinner tables, mentioned during report cards, promised whenever someone asked what I would do after high school. College, they always said. My college. But that afternoon, my parents sat across from me with the same calm expressions they used when discussing groceries or weather, and my mother explained that the fund had been reallocated. My brother sat in the kitchen behind them, pretending not to listen. They expected confusion, maybe tears, maybe an argument they could dismiss. What they did not expect was silence, and they definitely did not expect my grandmother to find out. In our town, people remembered things, not loudly, not with confrontation, but quietly. A man's reputation was not decided in arguments. It was decided over years, at church tables, in grocery store lines, in the long memory of neighbors who noticed more than they ever said out loud. My parents understood that system very well. My father worked in municipal planning for the county. Nothing high profile, nothing controversial. His job mostly involved approving permits and attending meetings where people spoke slowly and politely about zoning changes and drainage systems. He liked that kind of work. Predictable, measured. My mother ran the administrative office at the local medical clinic. She handled scheduling, billing disputes, insurance forms, things that required patience and attention to detail. Both of them were known as reliable people, quiet people, the kind neighbors trusted. Our house sat on the edge of town on a street where nothing changed much. The same oak trees leaned over the road every summer. The same mailboxes rusted slowly in place. People there had known each other for decades. That kind of place makes promises feel permanent. I grew up believing one of those promises more than any other, the college fund. It was never presented as something dramatic or impressive. My parents didn't talk about it like a prize. They talked about it like a fact, like gravity. Whenever teachers asked about the future, my mother would mention it casually. When the time comes, the college fund will take care of tuition. If relatives visited during holidays, my father would say something similar. We've been putting money aside since they were born. Not bragging, just explaining. The number slowly became clearer as I got older. $187,000. That was the amount my father mentioned during my junior year of high school while reviewing financial planning documents at the dining room table. He said it calmly, sliding the papers into a neat stack afterward. That should cover everything, he told my mother. She nodded like the matter was settled. I remember feeling something strange in that moment. Not excitement, more like relief. The kind of quiet relief you feel when a road ahead has already been cleared. My role, according to them, was simple. Study, keep my grades steady, choose a university carefully. Everything else had already been prepared. I believed them because my parents had always been consistent about things like that. If my father said something existed, it existed. If my mother said something was organized, it was. There was never any chaos around money in our house. Bills were paid early. Documents were labeled. Records were kept in thick folders inside a locked cabinet in the study. Nothing about our home suggested instability, except my brother. Daniel was 2 years older than me and operated according to a completely different set of rules. Where I was quiet, Daniel filled rooms with conversation. Where I preferred routines, he chased new plans every few months. Sports equipment, travel ideas, business ventures he described with excitement that faded almost as quickly as it appeared. People liked him. Teachers described him as full of potential. Neighbors said he had big energy. but potential and energy did not translate into consistency. Daniel changed majors twice during his short time at community college before eventually dropping out entirely. My parents never treated it like failure. They called it finding his path. When he left school, he moved back into the house and started talking about business opportunities that required equipment, transportation, and startup costs. My parents listened patiently. Sometimes they helped. Not dramatically, just small things, helping him repair an old truck, covering insurance payments when work was inconsistent. Things families do when someone is still figuring things out. None of that ever seemed connected to me. Our lives ran in parallel but separate directions. My path was structured. His path was experimental. The college fund belonged to that structure, a stable future waiting quietly in the background. The only person who occasionally treated that fund like something more serious was my grandmother. She lived 15 minutes away in a brick house near the old library downtown. Most people in town knew her, not because she talked much, but because she had lived there longer than almost anyone else. My grandfather had been a lawyer. After he passed, my grandmother kept most of his habits, organized records, careful conversations, and a tendency to observe more than she spoke. When she visited our house, she sometimes asked small questions about school, grades, applications, scholarships, not because we needed them, she would say, but preparation is always useful. Once, when I was 17, she sat beside me during a family dinner while my parents discussed my future the way they always had. The college fund, the universities, the timeline. She listened quietly. Then she said something simple. Money that sits for 18 years carries responsibility. My father nodded politely. My mother agreed. The conversation moved on. At the time, I didn't understand why my grandmother's words had sounded heavier than everyone else's. In our house, the college fund was not a risk. It was not a decision. It was simply part of the future, a promise that had existed my entire life. And promises like that, in a town where everyone remembered everything, were supposed to last. The first signs that something had changed did not arrive all at once. They appeared the way most problems begin in quiet households, through small moments that could be explained away. At first, it was Daniel's spending. He had always chased ideas, but usually the excitement faded before any real money was involved. This time felt different. One evening, he arrived home with a trailer attached to his truck. It carried 2 large pieces of landscaping equipment I had never seen before. Professional machines, the kind small businesses used. My father walked outside to look at them while Daniel spoke quickly about new contracts, seasonal demand, and expansion plans. I stayed near the doorway listening. What did those cost? My father asked. Daniel shrugged in a way that suggested the number did not matter. Good deal. Guy I know was selling everything together. My father nodded slowly, not approving, not questioning, just absorbing the information the way he did when something required thought. Later that night, I passed the kitchen while my parents spoke quietly near the sink. The conversation stopped when I entered. It wasn't abrupt, just slightly unfinished. My mother turned and asked if I needed anything. I said no. Moments like that began happening more often. Nothing dramatic, just conversations ending when I walked into the room. Another change appeared in the study. That room had always been open. My father kept financial documents there, tax records, mortgage statements, insurance paperwork. Organized, labeled, easy to access if needed. But sometime during my final year of high school, the door began staying closed more often. Not locked, just closed. One afternoon, I noticed my father sorting through folders while standing instead of sitting at the desk. He looked up when I passed the doorway. Just organizing a few things, he said. His voice was calm, the way it always was. But the folders disappeared into the cabinet faster than usual. Around the same time, conversations about my college plans became shorter. Not absent, just less detailed. Before, my parents liked discussing possibilities. Tuition costs, housing options, campus visits. Now the discussions ended quickly. "We'll handle the finances when the time comes," my mother would say, or my father would respond with something even simpler. "You focus on school." Neither statement was wrong. Still, the tone had shifted slightly. Less enthusiasm, more closure. At school, guidance counselors started preparing seniors for financial documentation. Families were asked to confirm savings accounts, grants, and expected contributions. When my counselor mentioned this during a meeting, I told her about the college fund. $187,000. She wrote the number down without hesitation. "That should make things straightforward," she said. I believed that too. Until the first small inconsistency appeared. A few weeks later, Daniel mentioned traveling to another city for equipment training related to his landscaping work. The trip would last several days. Hotels, registration fees, transportation. My mother asked practical questions while preparing dinner. My father mostly listened. Then he said something that caught my attention. "We'll figure it out." The words were ordinary, but the tone sounded heavier than expected for something temporary. Later that evening, I heard Daniel laughing on the phone in the living room. He described his plans confidently, said the equipment would allow him to take larger contracts, said it was an investment. What stayed with me wasn't the excitement, it was the certainty. Daniel spoke like the money for those investments already existed, like it had been arranged somewhere. Meanwhile, the financial statements that occasionally arrived by mail began disappearing faster than usual. My mother collected the mail every afternoon. Normally, she placed envelopes on the kitchen counter before sorting them. Now certain envelopes went directly into her hands and never touched the counter. Once I saw the corner of a familiar bank logo before she slid the letter into a folder. Again, nothing that proved anything. Families handle finances privately all the time. Still, the pattern continued. Daniel upgraded his truck. Not a new vehicle, but newer than the one he had. There was also a set of commercial tools stored in the garage a week later. Each edition came with explanations about business growth. Each explanation sounded reasonable, but something else was changing too. My parents no longer mentioned the college fund casually the way they used to. The subject simply stopped appearing in conversation. At first, I assumed it was because graduation was approaching and everyone expected things to move forward normally. There was no need to repeat the same promise over and over, except silence can sometimes feel louder than reassurance. One night during dinner, Daniel described a future project that would require expanding his equipment again. My father listened. My mother nodded slowly. Neither of them asked the obvious question about cost. I remember looking at them then, watching their expressions, trying to understand something that felt slightly out of alignment with the family I had always known. Nothing was openly wrong. No arguments, no raised voices, just a quiet shift in the atmosphere of the house. A shift small enough that anyone else might have ignored it. But once you notice a pattern beginning to change, it becomes difficult to stop watching. And without realizing it yet, that was exactly what I had started doing. Watching, listening, waiting for something that still had no clear shape. The first time I realized something might actually be wrong, it happened in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. No argument, no confrontation, just paper on a table. My father had been working in the study earlier that day. When he left for a county meeting, He carried his laptop but left a small stack of documents on the dining room table. That was not unusual. Our house had always treated paperwork like something normal. Bills, statements, tax documents, they appeared briefly in shared spaces before being sorted into the cabinet in the study. I walked past the table without thinking much about it. Then I noticed the bank logo. It was the same bank my parents had used for years, the same bank that held the college fund. I stopped. Not because I intended to read anything private, just because the document looked different than the ones I remembered. Most statements were simple summaries, balances, interest updates, routine numbers. But this page contained something else, a list of transfers, several of them, large ones. I did not sit down immediately. I just stood there for a moment, looking at the page from a distance, trying to decide whether it was even connected to the account I was thinking about. Then I stepped closer. The account name was familiar. Education Savings Trust. The same wording my father had used years earlier when explaining how the fund worked. But the numbers beside the transfer entries didn't make sense. They were withdrawals, not small adjustments or administrative fees. Actual transfers, $5,000, $10,000, $12,000, each one dated within the past year. For a moment, I assumed I was misunderstanding something. Maybe the account had been reorganized. Maybe the money had been moved into a different investment structure. My father had always talked about long-term planning, rebalancing, tax strategies. All things that sounded complicated enough to justify movement between accounts. Still, the frequency of the transfers felt strange. I counted 6 entries before hearing the garage door open. My mother had returned home. Without thinking too much about it, I stepped away from the table and continued walking toward the kitchen. She came through the door carrying grocery bags. "Can you help with these?" she asked. I nodded and started unloading items onto the counter. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Then she noticed the documents on the table. Her movement slowed slightly, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. She set the grocery bag down and gathered the papers together more quickly than necessary. "Your father must have forgotten these," she said. I waited a moment before speaking. "The education account," the question came out quietly, not accusatory, just curious. My mother hesitated, only for a second. "Yes," she said. "Just routine adjustments." She slid the documents into a folder and carried them toward the study. The door closed behind her. I stood in the kitchen holding a carton of milk that I had forgotten to put away. Routine adjustments. The explanation sounded reasonable, but something about the speed of the response stayed with me. That evening, I asked my father a different question, not about the transfers, about college planning. Applications had already been submitted, and acceptance letters were beginning to arrive. During dinner, I mentioned the financial aid forms the universities required. "They're asking for verification documents soon," I said. My father nodded while cutting his food. "We'll handle that when necessary." "Do they need statements from the education account?" He paused briefly. Then he shrugged. "Probably." The conversation ended there. No details, no numbers, just a vague promise to deal with it later. A few days after that, another moment happened at school. My guidance counselor called me into her office to review paperwork for one of the universities that had accepted me. Most of the meeting involved routine forms. Then she looked up from the screen. "Have your parents sent confirmation of the savings account yet?" I shook my head. "Not yet." She frowned slightly, not with suspicion, just confusion. "That's unusual. Most families submit it early if the funds are already designated." She turned the monitor slightly so I could see the checklist. "Financial documentation, pending." "Just remind them," she said. "It makes the process smoother." I nodded and left the office. On the walk home, I tried to replay the past year in my mind. Daniel's equipment purchases, the training trip, the upgraded truck, the closed door of the study, the bank statement with transfer entries. Each piece on its own still had a possible explanation. But when I placed them side by side, something else began forming. Not proof, not certainty, just a quiet question I could no longer ignore. If the college fund still existed exactly the way my parents had always described it, why did everything around it suddenly feel hidden? That night I lay awake longer than usual, not angry, not panicked, just thinking carefully about something I had never considered before. The possibility that the promise I had trusted for 18 years might not be as solid as I believed. And once that possibility appears, even faintly, it becomes difficult to push it away. Because every new detail begins to connect to it, even the ones you wish would not. For several days after seeing the statement, I did not mention it again. Part of me expected my parents to bring it up themselves. If the transfers were normal financial adjustments, they would probably explain them eventually. My father had always believed in careful planning. My mother had always believed in clear organization. Silence, however, began stretching longer than expected. The acceptance letters from universities kept arriving. Each one required some version of the same next step, confirmation of financial support, deadlines, documents, verification. Every form pointed back to the same promise my parents had repeated my entire life: the college fund. Eventually, I brought it up again during dinner. Not dramatically, just as part of the normal conversation about next year. The university sent the financial verification request, I said. They need documentation from the education account. My mother placed her fork down slowly. We'll take care of it. Her tone sounded slightly sharper than usual. I waited a moment. When? My father looked up from his plate. Why are you asking like that? I hesitated. I just need the documents for the application. He leaned back slightly in his chair. You're acting like we haven't been preparing for this your entire life. I know, I said quietly. Then trust that we know what we're doing. The words were not loud, but they closed the conversation. Daniel, who had been scrolling through his phone at the end of the table, looked up briefly. Seriously, he said, you're stressing everyone out over paperwork. No one responded to that. Dinner continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. That night I replayed the exchange several times in my mind. I had not accused anyone of anything. I had asked for documents required by the university. Still, the reaction had been defensive. A week later, the topic surfaced again by accident. I came home from school earlier than expected one afternoon. My father's truck was already in the driveway. Inside the house, I heard voices from the study. The door was closed again, not locked, just closed. Daniel's voice came through the wood first. You said that account was just sitting there. My father responded, but his voice was lower. I couldn't hear the full sentence. Then Daniel again. I'm not asking for charity. This is an investment. There was a pause, long enough that I almost walked away. Then my father said something clearly enough for me to hear. It was meant for something else. Silence followed. Footsteps approached the door. I moved down the hallway toward the kitchen before it opened. Daniel came out first. He looked surprised to see me. How long have you been home? He asked. Just got back. He studied my face for a moment. Then he shrugged and walked past me toward the garage. A few seconds later, my father stepped out of the study. His expression was neutral. Everything okay? He asked. Yes. The word came out automatically. He nodded once and went to the refrigerator for a glass of water. Neither of us mentioned the conversation. Later that evening, I tried again to ask about the account. This time, I approached it carefully. I saw a statement the other day, I said to my mother while she was folding laundry in the living room. Her hands stopped moving. What statement? The education account, she resumed, folding slowly. You shouldn't be reading financial documents that aren't yours. I wasn't trying to, it was on the table. That doesn't mean it was meant for you. Her voice had become colder. I just noticed some transfers, I said quietly. She exhaled, a long breath that sounded more tired than angry. You're misunderstanding what you saw. What were the transfers for? For managing the account. I waited. That's all. Yes. The answer came quickly, too quickly. I sat down across from her. Are you sure the money is still there? Her hands stopped again. This time she looked directly at me. The expression on her face was not guilt. It was disappointment. Do you really think we would lie to you about something like that? The question landed heavily in the room. I felt the weight of it immediately. Oh, I said, then stop creating problems where there aren't any. Daniel entered the room at that moment carrying a soda from the kitchen. What's going on? He asked. Nothing, my mother said. I stood up. I just asked about the college fund. Daniel laughed softly. You're still on that. It's not a big deal, I said. Exactly, he replied. So stop acting like it's some conspiracy. He leaned against the wall and took a drink. You've always been like this, he added. Overthinking everything. My mother nodded slightly. Your brother is right. You're letting stress make you suspicious. Suspicious. The word stayed with me. In a matter of minutes, the conversation had shifted completely. I had started by asking about financial documents required by my university. Now the problem, according to them, was my attitude, my mistrust, my imagination. I went upstairs without saying anything else. Inside my room, I sat at the desk where I usually studied. The house sounded normal again. Dishes in the kitchen, television in the living room, Daniel talking on the phone, everything functioning exactly the way it always had. Except now there was a new layer beneath it. A quiet realization forming slowly in the back of my mind. If nothing was wrong with the college fund, why did every question about it turn me into the problem? And more importantly, why did it feel like everyone in the house had agreed on that answer already? After that conversation, I stopped asking questions inside the house, not because the questions had disappeared, but because I understood something new about how they were being received. Every time I mentioned the college fund, the discussion stopped being about the account itself. It became about my attitude, my distrust, my imagination. That shift happened too quickly to be accidental, so I changed how I approached the situation. I stayed quiet. I paid attention. And I let the systems around the situation continue operating. Because systems rarely care about family narratives. They care about records, deadlines, verification. The first crack appeared through the mail. Most afternoons, my mother collected the envelopes before anyone else saw them. It had become routine over the past year. But one Tuesday, I arrived home early enough to reach the mailbox first. Among the usual advertisements and utility notices was a thicker envelope from the bank. The same bank that held the education account. I stood there for a moment with the envelope in my hand. My name was printed beneath my father's. That alone was unusual. Normally, statements were addressed only to my parents. I brought the envelope inside and placed it on the kitchen counter. For several minutes, I considered leaving it unopened. But my name was printed clearly on the front. That made it mine. When I opened it, the document inside looked different from the statements I remembered seeing before. This was not a routine balance summary. It was a notification, a confirmation letter regarding the closure of a managed education trust account. The language was formal and precise. It explained that the account had been fully liquidated through a series of authorized transfers over the previous 12 months. The final balance listed at the bottom of the page was 0. I read the number twice. Then a third time. 0. The original account balance had once been $187,000. Now the account no longer existed. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. For a long time, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the wall clock. The house was quiet. No one else was home yet. I did not feel angry in that moment. Mostly I felt something heavier, like a long-held assumption slowly dissolving. Every conversation about misunderstanding, every accusation of suspicion, every vague explanation about account management, they all rearranged themselves in my mind, not as confusion, but as strategy. My parents had not been avoiding the truth because they were uncertain. They had been avoiding it because they already knew the answer. The garage door opened about 20 minutes later. My mother walked inside carrying her usual bag from work. She noticed the envelope on the counter immediately. Her eyes moved from the bank logo to my name printed beneath my father's, then to me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. "You opened it," she said quietly. "My name was on it." She stepped closer and removed the document from the envelope. I watched her read the letter. Her expression did not change much. Only a small tightening around her eyes. When she finished, she folded the paper again and placed it back inside. "That shouldn't have been mailed to you," she said. "Why?" "It's administrative." "The account is gone." She did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the sink and turned on the faucet, rinsing a glass that was already clean. "Financial accounts move," she said after a moment. "They close. That one was for my college. It supported the family." The sentence landed quietly between us. I waited for her to explain further. She didn't. "How?" I asked. She turned off the faucet. "Daniel needed help." The words were simple, almost casual. As if that explanation resolved everything. I felt something inside me settle in a way I had not expected. Not rage, not disbelief, just confirmation. "So the money is gone." She faced me again. "You're young," she said. "You'll find other ways to go to school. And Daniel, he had opportunities that required investment." The phrasing sounded rehearsed, carefully constructed. Before I could respond, the front door opened. My grandmother stepped inside. She visited occasionally without much notice. The house had always been open to her. "Hello," she called from the entryway. My mother's posture changed immediately. "Hi, Mom," she said, forcing a lighter tone. My grandmother entered the kitchen slowly, setting her purse on the chair near the table. Her eyes moved from me to my mother, then to the envelope still resting on the counter. She didn't ask about it directly, not at first. Instead, she looked at me. "You seem very quiet today." "I'm just thinking," I said. She nodded slightly. Then she turned her attention to my mother. "What are they thinking about?" My mother hesitated. "College paperwork." My grandmother glanced at the envelope again, then back at me. "Is the paperwork correct?" For a moment no one spoke. Finally, I answered. "The college fund is gone." The room went still. My grandmother did not react immediately. She simply looked at my mother. A long, steady look that contained no raised voice, no accusation. Just expectation. And in that silence, something important changed. Because for the first time, the truth had been spoken in front of someone who was not part of the explanation. Someone who had been present long before the account existed. Someone who understood exactly how it had been created. My grandmother rested her hands on the table and said one calm sentence. "That account required my signature to open." Then she looked directly at my mother. "So I would like to understand what happened to it." The kitchen stayed quiet after my grandmother spoke. Not the comfortable quiet our house usually had. A different kind. The kind that forms when something undeniable has been placed in the middle of the room and no one knows how to move around it yet. My mother did not answer immediately. She pulled a chair away from the table and sat down slowly, as if the conversation required more stability than standing aloud. It's complicated, she said. My grandmother remained standing. Money rarely is, she replied calmly. Records usually explain it very clearly. My mother glanced toward me, then back to her. The account was used for family needs. Which needs? Daniel's business required investment. My grandmother nodded once, slowly absorbing the words. That account was not designed for business investment. It was our decision. Was it? The question was gentle, but it carried a precision that made the room feel smaller. My mother looked away for a moment before answering. Yes. At that point, the garage door opened again. Daniel walked in, carrying a tool bag over his shoulder. He stopped when he saw all three of us sitting in the kitchen. What's going on? My grandmother turned slightly toward him. We're discussing the education trust account. Daniel's posture tightened immediately. That again. My grandmother studied him. Do you know about the transfers? He laughed once. A short, dismissive sound. Of course I do. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Daniel, it's fine, he said, setting the tool bag down. Everyone's acting like something terrible happened. He looked directly at me. You're still planning to go to college, right? Yes. Then what's the problem? The money was meant for tuition, I said. And it still helped the family, he replied quickly. My grandmother watched the exchange carefully. Daniel, she said, how much of the account was transferred to you? He shrugged. I don't know the exact number. My grandmother turned to my mother. You would know. My mother's hands rested flat on the table. It accumulated over time. That is not an amount. Silence returned again. Finally, my mother spoke quietly. Most of it. My grandmother absorbed that answer without visible emotion. Most of $187,000. Yes. Daniel crossed his arms. You're saying it like we stole something. No one responded immediately. He continued. My business needed startup capital. Banks don't exactly hand out loans to people without collateral. That account was collateral, my grandmother said. For school, I added. For opportunity, Daniel replied. His voice had grown sharper now. You act like you're the only person in this family who matters. That account existed before your business, my grandmother said calmly. And now it supports one. He gestured toward the garage. You've seen the equipment. I'm building something real. My grandmother turned slightly, her attention settling back on my mother. Were there legal consultations before these transfers? My mother hesitated. No. Financial advisors? No. So the decision was made privately. Yes. The air in the kitchen felt heavier with every answer. My grandmother reached into her purse and removed a small notebook. She opened it slowly. I helped establish that account 18 years ago, she said. Your father and I set specific conditions for how the money could be used. My mother's eyes moved to the notebook. We were aware of the conditions. Then you are also aware that the trust required dual authorization for major liquidation. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? My grandmother did not look at him when she answered. It means the account should not have been emptied without formal notification to the original guarantor. My mother's voice tightened. Things change. Contracts do not. For the first time, a small amount of tension appeared in my grandmother's voice. Not anger, just firmness. Daniel shook his head. This is ridiculous. What part? She asked. The part where everyone acts like I'm some kind of criminal. No one used that word. But you're thinking it. He looked at me again. You started all this. I opened the mail, I said quietly. You went looking for problems. I asked about tuition. And we told you we'd handle it. The conversation had reached a familiar pattern again, questions turning into accusations. But this time the dynamic was different, because my grandmother was still there, watching, writing occasionally in the notebook. Daniel noticed it too. What are you doing? He asked. Keeping track. Of what? Facts. My mother shifted in her chair again. Mom, this doesn't need to turn into something official. It already is. How? My grandmother closed the notebook gently. Because that account existed under legal structure. She stood up slowly. And structures leave records, Daniel scoffed. So what, you're going to call the police over a family decision? No, she said calmly. I'm going to review the records. She turned toward me. Do you still have the letter from the bank? I nodded. It's in the envelope. Good. My grandmother picked it up from the counter. Then she looked back at my mother. I would like copies of every transfer statement connected to this account. That's not necessary. It is if the account was liquidated improperly. Daniel let out an exasperated breath. You're blowing this completely out of proportion. My grandmother met his gaze for the first time since he entered the room. Daniel, do you know what the town respects more than success? He didn't answer. Consistency. She held the envelope in one hand. Your parents have spent decades building a reputation for responsible planning. My mother's expression hardened. Are you threatening us? No, the word was soft. I am reminding you that financial decisions tied to trust accounts do not remain private forever. No one spoke after that. My grandmother walked toward the front door. Before leaving, she paused and turned back toward the kitchen. Her eyes moved briefly across each of us. Then she said something that would change everything that followed. I will speak with the bank tomorrow. And in a small town where people remembered things, that sentence carried consequences none of us could fully measure yet. After my grandmother left, the house felt different. Not louder, not chaotic, just strained in a way that was difficult to describe. Daniel returned to the garage and stayed there for the rest of the evening. I could hear the sound of tools occasionally, metal clinking against metal, the slow hum of a machine starting and stopping. My parents stayed in the kitchen. They spoke quietly for a long time. I did not try to listen. By that point, I already knew enough. The next morning, the house moved through its normal routine as if nothing had happened. My father left for work before sunrise. My mother followed shortly after. Daniel's truck was gone by the time I came downstairs. The envelope from the bank was no longer on the counter, but I already had a copy of the letter. The night before, after everyone had gone to bed, I had taken a photo of the document with my phone. Not because my grandmother had asked me to, because something inside me understood that records mattered now. The rest of that week moved slowly. My grandmother did exactly what she said she would do. She spoke with the bank. She spoke with the attorney who had helped establish the trust account nearly 2 decades earlier. And she spoke with my parents. Those conversations did not happen inside our house. But their effects reached us anyway. The first sign appeared 3 days later when my father came home earlier than usual. He did not sit down for dinner. Instead, he went straight into the study and closed the door. My mother joined him a few minutes later. Their voices stayed low, but this time they were not careful enough to keep the tension out of them. Words drifted down the hallway. Documentation. Authorization. Why would she contact them? I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, pretending to work on a scholarship application. Daniel arrived an hour later. He walked into the house with his usual energy, then stopped when he saw the closed study door. What's going on now? He asked. I shrugged. Grandma talked to the bank. He stared at me. You told her everything. She asked, and you just handed it to her. She helped create the account. That doesn't mean she gets to interfere. I didn't respond. Daniel paced the kitchen for a moment. You know what this looks like, he said finally. I waited. It looks like you're trying to destroy the family because things didn't go exactly the way you wanted. The accusation landed softly, not because it was gentle, because by then I understood how the narrative inside the house worked. Any challenge to what had happened would always become my fault. I closed the laptop. I didn't take the money. That money wasn't just yours. It was for my education. It was for the future, he snapped. And my business is part of that. I studied his face for a moment. He truly believed what he was saying, not as a lie, as justification. Before I could answer, the study door opened. My parents stepped into the hallway. My father's expression looked more tired than angry. My mother's face was tight with frustration. Daniel turned toward them immediately. "What did the bank say?" My father rubbed his forehead slowly. "They confirmed the transfers." "That's not a problem. They also confirmed the trust structure." Daniel frowned. "And," my mother answered this time, "and the structure required notification to your grandmother before liquidation." Daniel laughed again, but this time the sound lacked confidence. "So what? It's still your money." My father looked at him carefully. "It wasn't entirely." The room went quiet. My mother crossed her arms. "The trust was established with shared oversight." Daniel looked between them. "You're saying Grandma had control over it." "Not control," my father said. "Authority." The difference between those two words settled heavily in the hallway. Daniel shook his head. "This is insane." "No," my father replied quietly. "This is legal." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel pointed toward me. "This started because they couldn't stop asking questions." My father did not respond to the accusation. Instead, he looked at me, not with anger, with something closer to resignation. "You should focus on your applications," he said. "I am." "Good." My mother added something else. "You could still apply for loans." The suggestion sounded practical, reasonable, almost supportive, except we all understood what it meant. The promise that had existed my entire life had been replaced with debt, not through accident, through decision. I nodded once. "I'll figure something out." No one apologized. No one acknowledged what had been taken. The conversation ended there. Daniel returned to the garage. My parents went back into the study, and I sat at the kitchen table again, staring at the scholarship application on my screen. For the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself to accept the full truth of the situation. The money was gone. The people who had promised to protect it believed they were justified in using it, and nothing I said inside this house would ever change that. So I stopped trying. Not because I forgave them, because I understood something more important. This situation was no longer unfolding inside our family. It was moving outward, into records, into institutions, into the quiet systems my grandmother trusted more than arguments. And those systems did not depend on anyone believing me. They depended on documentation, which meant the outcome was already beginning to form, even if no one inside the house was ready to see it yet. The town did not learn about what happened all at once. Information rarely spreads that way in places like ours. It moves slowly, through records first, then through conversations that begin carefully and end with quiet understanding. The first changes appeared in places outside our house. My grandmother did not return immediately after her visit to the bank. Several days passed before I saw her again, but her presence could still be felt. Financial institutions began requesting additional documentation from my parents. Letters arrived asking for clarification about the liquidation of the education trust. My father spent longer hours in the study responding to them. At dinner, he spoke less. My mother sorted mail with a tension that had not been there before. Daniel pretended none of it mattered. His equipment still filled the garage. His business plans still filled the air whenever he talked about the future. But something subtle had shifted around him. The equipment suppliers he worked with began asking for payment timelines. Insurance companies requested updated financial disclosures. And the bank, our bank, the one that had held the college fund for 18 years, sent multiple notices requesting a meeting. None of these developments involved raised voices. They were simply part of how institutions operate when questions appear in official files. About 2 weeks after my grandmother first visited the house, I saw her again at the grocery store downtown. She was standing near the produce section, speaking quietly with Mr. Halpern, the bank manager. Both of them noticed me at the same moment. My grandmother nodded slightly. Not a greeting, more like acknowledgement. Mr. Halpern gave a polite smile. "Good afternoon," he said. I returned the greeting and continued through the store. No one stopped me. No one asked questions. But later that evening, my father came home with a different expression than usual. Not anger, not fear, something heavier, recognition. He called a family meeting in the living room. We rarely had those. When everyone sat down, he spoke slowly. "The bank has completed their review." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "And they confirmed the transfers were legally authorized by us." Daniel smiled slightly. "See, no problem." My father continued before the moment could settle. "But the trust agreement required notification to the original guarantor before the account was liquidated." Daniel's smile faded. "That's just paperwork." "It's more than paperwork." My mother added something quietly. "Your grandmother filed a formal complaint with the bank's oversight committee." Daniel looked between them again. "Why would she do that?" My father answered carefully. "Because she helped establish the account. And because she believes the purpose of the trust was violated." Daniel scoffed. "So what happens now?" My father hesitated. "The bank reported the situation to their regional office for review. And they are also required to document the complaint in their public compliance records." That sentence seemed to confuse Daniel. "What does that even mean?" "It means," my mother said slowly, "that the situation is no longer private." The room went quiet. My father looked down at his hands. "In towns like this," he said, "people eventually notice things that appear in official records." Daniel stood up abruptly. "You're telling me Grandma is trying to ruin us over money?" "No," my father replied. "She's documenting what happened." Later that week, I began noticing how that documentation worked in practice. At the library downtown, 2 older men were discussing banking regulations near the front desk. When they saw me enter, the conversation stopped. At the post office, the clerk who had known my parents for years asked how my college applications were going. Her tone was kind, but the question carried weight. Word had begun circulating, not through gossip, but through curiosity. Questions about the trust account. Questions about why the guarantor had contacted the bank. Questions about why the education fund had disappeared. My grandmother never confronted my parents publicly. She never raised her voice. But she also never hid the truth when people asked direct questions. And in a town where people remembered things, honest answers traveled far. Within a month, the consequences became clearer. Daniel's equipment supplier refused to extend additional credit. The bank declined his request for a business expansion loan. Insurance premiums increased after financial disclosures were reviewed. None of those outcomes were punishments. They were simply the result of institutions reevaluating risk. One evening, I saw my grandmother sitting on the bench outside the courthouse square. I stopped for a moment. "Did you tell everyone?" I asked. She looked at me thoughtfully. "I told the truth when it was asked." "That's different." "In small towns," she said quietly, "it rarely is." We sat there for a moment in silence. The courthouse clock chimed above us. "I didn't want to fight," I said. "I know. And I didn't want people choosing sides." "They're not choosing sides," she replied. "They're choosing information." She stood slowly and adjusted her coat. "Reputation," she added, "is simply the record people remember when no one is arguing." Then she walked toward her car. And for the first time since the account had disappeared, I understood what real consequences looked like. Not shouting, not revenge, just the quiet weight of truth becoming impossible to ignore. By the end of summer, the house felt quieter than it ever had before, not peaceful, just empty in ways that were difficult to explain. Daniel moved out first. His landscaping equipment disappeared from the garage over several weekends. Some of it was sold. Some of it was returned to the suppliers who had originally extended credit. He did not announce his plans. One morning, his truck was simply gone. My parents did not talk about where he went. They also did not talk about the college fund again. Inside the house, life continued through routine. My father went to work each morning at the county office. My mother continued managing schedules at the clinic. From the outside, they still looked like the same dependable people our town had always known. But something in their conversations with neighbors had changed. They spoke more carefully now, listened longer. Reputation, once unquestioned, had become something fragile. As for me, college still happened, just not the way it was originally promised. Scholarships covered part of the cost. Part-time work covered the rest. The campus was smaller than the universities I had once imagined attending, but it was enough. Before I left for my first semester, I visited my grandmother one last time. She was sitting at the same small kitchen table where she kept her notebooks. The same notebook she had used to record the details of the trust account years earlier. "You didn't have to do all that," I told her. She looked up calmly. "Yes, I did." "Why?" "Because promises are records," she said, "and records matter." I nodded slowly. Neither of us mentioned my parents. Neither of us mentioned Daniel. Some truths did not need repeating. When I left her house that afternoon, she walked me to the door and said one final thing. "People believe power comes from loud decisions," she said. Then she shook her head slightly. "Most of the time it comes from remembering what actually happened." Years later, the town still remembered, not as gossip, not as scandal, just as part of the quiet record people carried with them. The education fund that disappeared, the grandmother who asked questions, and the truth that eventually found its way into the open without anyone needing to raise their voice.